Jason stood among the crowd on the alien planet, his eyes scanning the busy marketplace. The air smelled different here, thick with the scent of strange fruits and spices, mixed with the faint tang of metal from the towering ships overhead. He was part of a small group of humans sent to assist with peacekeeping efforts, but so far, the only thing that felt peaceful was the quiet that seemed to fall over the planet at night. By day it was loud, bustling, and filled with all kinds of life forms from across the galaxy. Today, however, felt different. It was supposed to be a normal routine meeting with the royal delegation of this alien world. He had been told to stay close to Princess Zora, a figure he had only heard about in rumors. She was known for being tough, smart, and powerful. No one had ever mentioned how she felt about humans, but Jason wasn't expecting much. Princess Zora had always been distant from the humans who came here. She believed that interactions with them would be more trouble than they were worth, but the galaxy's peace was in their hands, and Jason's role was to ensure that nothing got out of control. That as the meeting began, Jason watched as the princess entered the room. She walked with a grace that only someone of royal blood could possess, her sharp eyes scanning the room, evaluating everyone. She was tall, with skin that shimmered like the midnight sky. Her alien features were striking, slightly more angular than what Jason was used to, with glowing patterns that ran down her arms and face, a symbol of her royal status. Zora glanced at Jason as she walked past him, but she didn't acknowledge him. She didn't have to. He knew how this worked. Humans, at least the ones on this planet, were seen as outsiders. Even with their peacekeeping mission, they were still viewed with skepticism. The meeting was long and full of diplomatic talk Jason could barely follow. Zora remained stoic, focused entirely on the discussions. Jason shifted in his seat, glancing around at the alien delegates who spoke in a mix of languages. He didn't understand half of what was being said, but he tried to keep his focus, knowing the importance of his presence here. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the room. The walls shook, and before Jason could react, the door slammed open. In rushed a group of alien extremists, angry and shouting in their native tongue. Jason immediately went into defensive mode. His instincts kicked in, and he was on his feet, moving toward the princess before he could even think. There was chaos, screams. The guards tried to intervene, but they were outnumbered. In the blink of an eye, Jason found himself next to Zora, grabbing her arm and pulling her behind him. "Stay down," he shouted, his voice calm despite the adrenaline racing through him. But as he moved, everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Zora, startled and unprepared for the sudden action, was pushed toward him. In a desperate attempt to shield her, Jason tried to catch her, but he wasn't fast enough. His body collided with hers, sending them both crashing to the floor. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing and the chaos around them. Zora's eyes widened as she looked up at him, their faces inches apart. Her skin flushed with a mix of anger and surprise. She was not used to being touched, especially by humans. Her people valued personal space above all else, and this was not just a violation of her personal space. It was a breach of everything she stood for. Jason, however, didn't seem to care. His mind was still processing everything happening around them, trying to keep her safe. He quickly stood, helping her to her feet. "I'm sorry, princess," he said, brushing off his uniform. "It wasn't my intention." Zora, now standing, straightened her clothes and looked at him coldly. "Stay away from me, human," she snapped, her voice sharp. "Do not touch me again." Jason nodded, taken aback by the harshness of her words, but he understood. He had been in enough situations to know how important boundaries were, especially in moments like this. The fight was over as quickly as it had started. The extremists were subdued, and the room returned to a tense silence. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He had seen the way Zora looked at him, anger mixed with something else, something deeper. It was more than just a moment of physical contact. It was the beginning of something that neither of them could have predicted. As Zora left the room, flanked by her guards, she didn't even glance back at Jason. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to feel. He hadn't meant to upset her, but it seemed like he had. And now, the real question remained, would she ever forgive him for what had happened? Or would that brief moment of physical contact define their relationship from here on out? Jason wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. This was far from over. The days following the incident were filled with tension. Jason couldn't shake the image of Zora's eyes, full of surprise and anger, as they locked for that brief moment. On the floor, he had only been trying to protect her, to keep her safe. But to Zora, it had been a mistake, a violation of something sacred. Zora's reaction was clear. She wanted nothing to do with him. Jason knew better than to approach her. Again, as a peacekeeper, He had dealt with hostile situations before, but this felt different. She wasn't an enemy, but his actions had made her see him as one. Jason continued with his duties, but there was a distance between him and the princess that he could not ignore. Whenever their paths crossed, Zora would look at him with a cold, distant gaze as if he didn't exist. There were no more words of greeting, no shared conversations, just silence. One morning, Jason found himself alone on a balcony overlooking the city, watching the sun rise over the distant mountains. The landscape was breathtaking, filled with colors he had never seen on Earth: vibrant purples, fiery oranges, and deep blues. He liked to come here when things got heavy, just to clear his mind. But today, his thoughts were tangled with memories of Zora Day, where she had looked at him with those piercing eyes, filled with an emotion he couldn't place. He wished he could go back and undo that moment, but what was done was done. "You're here again." Jason turned around quickly, startled by the sudden voice. It was Zora. She stood a few feet away from him, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She wasn't looking directly at him, but he could tell she was still cautious, like a wild animal unsure if it should trust its captor. "I come here to think," Jason said softly, trying to keep his voice neutral. "I didn't expect to see you." Zora's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "I didn't expect to be here either," she replied, her voice quieter than usual. "But I have questions." Jason's heart skipped a beat. Questions? Did she mean about the incident, or was this about something else? He was nervous, unsure of what to say next. "About the attack?" he asked carefully. Zora nodded, her eyes still focused on the landscape. "About you," she said, her voice low but firm. "Why did you touch me? You didn't have to. You could have protected me without ... that." Jason felt his stomach tighten. He knew she was angry, but the sadness in her tone was unexpected. "I wasn't thinking about anything else except keeping you safe," he said honestly. "I thought we were under attack. I didn't even realize what was happening until it was too late." Zora finally turned to look at him. Her gaze was still distant, but there was a flicker of curiosity. "You didn't think about what?" Jason frowned. He wasn't sure what she was asking. "What do you mean?" Zora's eyes flicked to the ground, then back to him. "Humans and aliens ... we are not the same. We don't understand each other's customs. Jason, you did what felt natural to you, but to me ... it was wrong." Jason felt a knot form in his chest. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I was just trying to protect you. I never thought..." Zora cut him off, her voice rising slightly. "You didn't think about what it means for someone like me to be touched like that. My people don't allow such contact unless it's earned." She paused, as if struggling to find the right words. "We are trained from birth to keep our distance. It is how we survive." Jason took a step forward, his voice gentle. "I understand, but Zora, I would never hurt you. I would never take advantage of your trust. I just wanted to make sure you were safe." She looked at him, and for a moment, he thought she might soften, but the anger was still there, lurking beneath the surface. "I know you meant well," she said, her voice quieter now, "but you don't understand. It's not about protection, it's about respect." Jason stood there in silence for a moment, trying to process what she was saying. Then, ... "What do I need to do?" Zora's face softened, but only just. "You need to respect my space, my boundaries. I don't need your protection, I need your understanding." Jason nodded, taking a deep breath. He had heard the words, but understanding them was a different matter. He wasn't sure how to fix this. "I'll do better," said, his voice sincere. "I didn't mean to cross a line. I'll respect your space." Zora seemed to consider this for a moment, her eyes studying him carefully. "Good," she said finally. "I need time. You need time. But don't think I've forgiven you yet, Jason. You've crossed a line, and it's going to take more than words to erase it." Jason bowed his head slightly. "I understand. I'll earn your trust." Zora gave a small nod before turning away. "We'll see," she said quietly, and with that, she walked off, leaving Jason alone on the balcony. Once more, as he watched her disappear into the distance, Jason couldn't help but wonder what it would take to truly earn her trust. He had crossed a line, yes, but he was determined to find a way to make things right. He had to. For both of them. Days passed, and Jason stayed true to his word. He kept his distance from Zora, focusing on his tasks, but the tension between them never fully went away. He couldn't help but notice her every time she entered a room or passed by. There was something about her, something he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried, but he respected her space. He stayed out of her way, just as she had asked. One afternoon the peaceful atmosphere of the planet shifted. Jason and Zora were assigned to accompany a diplomatic envoy to a neighboring settlement, a place where tensions between rival species had been escalating for weeks. The situation was delicate, and both human and alien leaders hoped that the presence of a neutral force would help calm things down. Jason wasn't looking forward to the trip. The last thing he wanted was another reminder of the awkwardness between him and Zora, but duty called, and he was determined to do his job well, even if it meant avoiding any further personal interaction with her. The journey was uneventful at first. Zora remained quiet, her attention focused on the diplomatic matters at hand, while Jason kept an eye on their surroundings. The alien landscape outside the transport window seemed peaceful, but Jason had learned long ago that nothing was ever truly calm when dealing with intergalactic politics. As they neared the settlement, the situation quickly took a turn for the worse. A loud explosion erupted in the distance, followed by the sound of gunfire. The convoy's security detail immediately sprang into action, but Jason knew they were outnumbered. The peaceful negotiations they had hoped for were quickly turning into a violent conflict. Zora's eyes widened, her body stiffening as the reality of the situation set in. Jason quickly reached for her, instinctively pulling her behind him as he moved toward the source of the attack. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low but firm. Zora didn't protest. She trusted him now, though she would never admit it aloud. The sound of blaster fire grew louder as the enemy forces closed in on their position. Jason's heart raced as he prepared to defend Zora. But the reality of the situation was clear. He wasn't sure they were going to make it out alive. As they moved through the settlement's narrow streets, they were ambushed. Alien assailants, armed and dangerous, appeared from all sides, taking the convoy by surprise. Jason pushed Zora against the wall for cover, his heart pounding in his chest as he took stock of the situation. "We need to move," Jason said urgently. "Get to the shuttle, now." But before they could move, a blast of energy hit the wall near them, sending debris flying in all directions. Zora was thrown off balance, stumbling toward Jason. He reached out instinctively, catching her in his arms. This time, it wasn't a misstep or accident, it was a matter of survival. The force of the blast had knocked Zora to the ground, and Jason, unable to let her fall, dropped to one knee beside her. He quickly checked for injuries, his hands moving over her to ensure she was unharmed. Zora's eyes locked onto his, her breath shallow and quick. "What are you doing?" she gasped, clearly disoriented. Jason's face was inches from hers. He couldn't stop himself from pulling her closer, his hands on her shoulders. As he shielded her from another round of incoming fire, he had no time to think, no time to second-guess. His sole focus was keeping her alive. "I'm keeping you safe," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I promised you, didn't I?" Zora didn't say anything at first. Her eyes searched his face, a mix of confusion and something else, something Jason couldn't quite place. But as the battle raged on around them, Zora's gaze softened ever so slightly. For the first time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she let him help her, let him shield her, and in that moment, a strange understanding passed between them. The gunfire continued, but Jason's attention never wavered from Zora. His heart raced, but not from fear. He had faced danger countless times before. It was the thought of losing her, of failing to protect her, that made his pulse race. Zora's voice was barely a whisper. "You're not like other humans." Jason didn't have time to respond. The moment was fleeting, and the danger was far from over. He could feel her warmth, her breath against his skin, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to focus on that. The noise, the explosions, the violence around them, all of it faded away. "Stay down," he ordered, his tone gentle but urgent. "I'll get you to safety." Zora nodded, a quiet determination in her eyes. She trusted him. There was no longer any question about that. But the truth was, they weren't out of danger yet. They still had to make it to the shuttle, and that wasn't going to be easy with the enemy closing in. Jason's instincts kicked in. He pulled Zora to her feet, guiding her through the chaos, moving fast but staying low. Every step brought them closer to safety, but every second counted. They were running out of time, and Jason knew the odds weren't in their favor. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the shuttle. Jason helped Zora aboard, his mind still on the battle. Behind them, he didn't feel safe until the door slammed shut, and the shuttle's engines roared to life. Only then did he allow himself a deep breath. Zora was silent beside him, her face pale, but her gaze no longer cold. There was something different between them now. The walls had come down, not because of words, but because of the trust forged. In the heat of battle, as the shuttle lifted off and the settlement disappeared below them, Jason couldn't help but glance at Zora. She was still the same fierce princess, but something had shifted between them, a connection that no amount of space or distance could undo. And as they soared into the sky, Jason realized that this mission had changed everything. The days after their close call were tense but peaceful. The immediate danger had passed, and the team had returned to base to regroup. Jason and Zora found themselves avoiding each other, each wrapped up in their own thoughts. It wasn't that things were back to normal, nothing would be the same after everything that had happened, but it was clear that something had shifted between them. Zora, once distant and cold, had begun to soften. Jason could see it in the way she didn't immediately turn away when he entered a room. She didn't give him the cold stare she had before. The silence that had hung between them felt a little less heavy. That as the days passed, Zora's behavior toward Jason changed, but it was subtle, almost unnoticeable at times. She would nod at him in passing, a small gesture that spoke volumes. Sometimes, when they were in meetings, her gaze would linger just a little longer than usual. Jason, for his part, was careful to maintain his distance, as she had asked. He wanted to be respectful of her boundaries, but it wasn't easy. There was an undeniable pull between them that neither could deny. One afternoon, Jason was on his way to the training grounds when he bumped into Zora in the hall. She was walking quickly, as if she had somewhere important to be. Their eyes met for a split second, and Jason felt the familiar tension that had been there since that first awkward moment. But instead of walking past him, Zora stopped. "Jason," she said, her voice a little quieter than usual. "We need to talk." Jason blinked in surprise. He had expected her to keep walking, to ignore him like she had done so many times before. But this time, she had stopped, and it made his heart race. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. "What's on your mind?" Zora hesitated, as if unsure of how to continue. I've been thinking," she began slowly, "about what you said, about protecting me." She paused, then looked directly at him. "You didn't have to do that. You could have stayed behind like the others, but you didn't. Why?" Jason thought for a moment before answering. He hadn't really thought about it in those terms before. It wasn't something he had planned, it had been instinct, a reflex that came naturally. He couldn't have let anything happen to her, not when she was in danger. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I guess it was just the right thing to do. I couldn't leave you behind." Zora's eyes softened, and for the first time since their first meeting, there was no coldness in her gaze. "I'm not used to people putting themselves in danger for me," she said quietly, "but I understand now why you did." Jason nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had always respected Zora, but this was the first time she had shown any sign of respect for him. It meant more to him than he could express. They stood there for a moment, the air between them no longer charged with tension. For the first time in a long time, Jason felt like they were on the same page. "Thank you," Zora said after a long pause, "for understanding my space, for not pushing me." Jason smiled. "Of course, I meant it when I said I'd respect your boundaries. I know that means more than just staying away." Zora's lips twitched in a small smile, and for a moment, she looked almost human. It was a rare sight, and Jason couldn't help but feel a little lighter in her presence. Maybe I've been too harsh," she admitted, her voice almost shy. "It's just my people have always been taught to keep distance, to protect ourselves from others. But you've shown me that maybe not all contact is bad." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected such an admission from her. It was a rare thing for anyone, let alone someone like Zora, to admit when they had been wrong. "You don't have to apologize," Jason said quickly. "I understand. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to keep you safe." Zora nodded. She seemed to think for a moment before speaking again. "I've realized something. I don't mind when you're close. You've earned my trust, Jason. That's more than I ever expected from anyone." Jason's eyes widened, the weight of her words sinking in. Trust. That was something that had taken months to build, and now she was giving it to him. "I won't let you down," he promised, his voice sincere. For the first time since they met, Zora looked at him with something akin to admiration in her eyes. It was a subtle shift, but it was there. Jason could feel it. "Let's get to work," she said after a long pause, her usual strength returning. "There's a lot to do, and I think we can get through it together." Jason nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Together," he echoed, feeling the weight of that simple word. They walked side by side down the hall, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, respect, and the beginnings of something new. Jason knew there was still much to be done. The mission wasn't over, and neither was the journey they were on. But in that moment he felt something he hadn't felt before: hope. The distance between him and Zora was closing, and for the first time he felt like they were truly on the same team. And that, in itself, was a victory. The following days were full of tension, but not the kind Jason had grown used to. There was a new kind of understanding between him and Zora. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was better. They still had moments where the silence between them felt thick, but there was something else now. Respect. The walls that Zora had built around herself were slowly crumbling, and Jason was determined to help her rebuild them with trust, not distance. Despite the shift, the work wasn't getting any easier. Tensions on the planet continued to rise, and the enemies they had faced before were not the only ones they needed to worry about. Zora had become a target for more than just political reasons. The rival factions were now more determined to destroy her leadership and her influence. The council had ordered them to visit a remote part of the planet, an area that had seen the worst of the violence. Zora had requested Jason's help in the matter, as the planet's leaders had become divided over how to approach the ongoing crises. Jason wasn't sure why she specifically asked for him, but he couldn't turn her down. The atmosphere was heavy as they boarded the transport, the hum of the ship's engines vibrating beneath their feet. Zora stood by the window, gazing out at the barren landscape. Jason sat nearby, his mind running over the mission details. The mission was meant to be diplomatic, a chance to speak directly with the leaders of the disputed territories. But Jason had been trained for more than just diplomacy. He was ready for anything. He glanced over at Zora, who still seemed lost in thought. There were no guards around this time, no safety net. It would be just the two of them facing the unknown. Jason had a feeling it wasn't just the mission that weighed on Zora's mind. She turned to look at him then, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time in a long while, she spoke first. "You've been distant," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the hum of the transport. "Since the attack, I thought things would change between us." Jason hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He had tried to keep his distance, to respect the boundaries she had set, but there were times when the pull between them was too strong, when the silence felt too heavy to bear. "I didn't want to push you," Jason said slowly. "I thought that's what you wanted, space. I've been trying to give you that." Zora looked at him for a long moment, her eyes hard to read. "It's not about space, Jason," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's about trust. I don't want to keep you at arm's length anymore, but I need you to know that I don't trust easily." Jason nodded. "I understand, and I'll keep earning it, every day." Zora's eyes softened for just a moment, before she turned away, returning her gaze to the window. "We don't have time for misunderstandings anymore," she said quietly. Jason knew what she meant. The mission ahead was crucial. They had to bring peace, and they couldn't afford to be distracted. He was a soldier, yes, but he was also a human, and despite everything that had happened, there was a part of him that couldn't help but want something more. He wasn't sure what that something was, but he would be patient. Zora needed him now, not as a soldier, but as someone she could count on. The transport finally landed in the heart of the disputed region, a place that had been torn apart by years of conflict. The ground was scarred, and the air thick with dust. As they stepped off the ship, the sounds of distant clashes echoed across the landscape. It was clear the peace talks were about to be far from easy. Zora took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the surroundings. She looked more vulnerable than usual, despite the armor she wore. Jason noticed a small, almost imperceptible shift in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed. She was afraid, not of the danger outside, but of what lay ahead of the meeting she had to face. He moved closer to her, his presence steady and reassuring. "I'm right here," he said quietly. "We'll get through this." Zora glanced at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment it seemed like she might say something, but instead, she simply nodded. They both knew the risks, but in this moment, there was no time for fear. The meeting with the local leaders was tense from the start. Words were exchanged, sharp, pointed accusations and threats that filled the room with an unspoken bitterness. Jason kept his eyes on Zora, watching her carefully as she navigated the conversation with the grace and precision of someone who had been born to lead. But even she couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands. As she gestured toward the map on the table, the discussions went on for hours, but no progress was made. The more they tried to talk, the more the division seemed to widen. It was clear that the opposing factions were not interested in peace, they were interested in control. Jason could see the frustration building in Zora, but she remained calm, cool, composed. Finally, Jason stood. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't ask permission, he just walked to the center of the room. his gaze focused and intense. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This isn't getting anyone anywhere." Zora looked at him in surprise, but Jason didn't wait for her approval. He turned to the leaders, his voice firm and commanding. "We're not here to argue over power, we're here to find a solution. If you want peace, you'll start acting like it." The room fell silent. Zora watched him, her expression a mix of disbelief and something else, something softer. For the first time, she didn't seem to mind his interference. She was still the leader, but Jason had shown her something valuable. Sometimes it was okay to step outside the lines for the right reasons. The room remained quiet, but this time, the silence wasn't filled with tension. It was filled with the possibility of change. The days following their tense meeting with the local leaders were a blur. Despite the harsh words exchanged, something had shifted in the room. Jason had spoken, and for once, it felt like Zora didn't mind. She had watched him stand up to the leaders, his words cutting through the tension in a way her royal training couldn't, and maybe, just maybe, she had started to see him in a new light. Their bond, once strained and distant, was now growing, slowly but surely, Zora no longer gave Jason the cold shoulder, and he didn't hesitate to stand by her when needed. It was a subtle shift, but it was there, and Jason couldn't help but feel that something deeper was beginning to form. One morning, after a week of grueling talks and barely any sleep, Jason found himself once again standing by the transport, waiting for Zora. She had called for him, but this time, it was different. There was no mission, no danger on the horizon, just a quiet moment between the two of them. Zora walked toward him, her usual confident stride softened by the exhaustion of the past few days. Her face looked tired, her eyes heavy with the weight of responsibility, but when she saw Jason, a flicker of something else passed through her gaze. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Jason saw it. He had learned to read her by now, to understand the subtle shifts in her demeanor. "Jason." Zora greeted him, her voice low and tired but warm. "I need a break. Would you join me for a walk?" Jason didn't hesitate. Of course. They began walking side by side, the silence between them no longer uncomfortable. As they walked through the quiet paths of the base, Jason could feel the weight of their unspoken words, the bond they were building. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. "You know," Zora said after a while, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and about you." Jason glanced over at her, his curiosity piqued. "What about me?" Zora looked up at the sky, the endless expanse above them making her seem even smaller, almost fragile. "I've always been so focused on my duties, on being the leader my people need. I never thought I would rely on anyone, not like this." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He could hear the vulnerability in her voice, the admission that she was not invincible. She wasn't just the cold, distant princess anymore, she was human, just like him. "I never expected this either," Jason said, his voice quiet. "I didn't expect to be in this situation, working with you like this. But I'm here, Zora. I'll always be here for you as long as you need me." She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, before a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "I think I'm starting to believe that." They continued walking, the peaceful silence between them comforting. The weight of their responsibilities still loomed over them, but, for the first time in a long time, Jason felt like they could handle it together. They didn't need to be perfect, but they had each other and that was enough. Later that day, Jason and Zora were called to another meeting with the council. This time the atmosphere was different. There was no longer the usual tension that came with these high-stakes negotiations. Jason and Zora entered the room together, and for the first time, it felt natural. There were no formalities between them, no awkwardness. Zora's gaze met his, and they exchanged a brief but meaningful glance before turning their attention to the council. The meeting was still long and full of discussions, but this time, something had changed. Zora wasn't alone. Jason was by her side, his quiet support making all the difference. The council members noticed the shift, and their respect for Zora grew. They could see that she wasn't just a leader by title anymore, she had someone who truly understood her. Someone who could stand by her side and help her through the most difficult decisions. The talks that day were productive. For the first time, the council seemed to agree on a plan that would lead to peace. There was still a long way to go, but the breakthrough was significant. Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the progress they had made. It wasn't just Zora's leadership that had led them here, it was their partnership. As the meeting ended and the council members filed out, Zora turned to Jason. Her expression was thoughtful, but there was a spark in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "You did good today," she said, her voice low but genuine. "I couldn't have done this without you." Jason smiled, though he kept his tone light. "It wasn't just me. We're a team, remember?" Zora's lips curved into a small smile, and for the first time, it felt like she wasn't just acknowledging his help, she was recognizing him as an equal. It was a shift in their relationship, and Jason knew that this moment would be one they would both remember for a long time. Later that evening, after another long day of negotiations and briefings, Zora found Jason on the balcony, staring out at the stars. She stepped quietly beside him, and for a moment, they just stood together in the silence. "I'm glad you're here," Zora said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything they had been through. "I never realized how much I needed someone I could trust, until now." Jason turned to her, his gaze soft but sincere. "I'm glad I'm here to..." As they looked out at the stars together, Jason realized that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, but for the first time he didn't feel like he was walking this path alone. He had Zora by his side, and that made all the difference. Together they could face anything. The weeks that followed were filled with new challenges. Jason and Zora had become a team, not just in word but in action. The diplomatic talks were progressing, though the political situation remained tense. It was clear to everyone that the peace they were working toward wasn't going to be easily achieved. But for the first time, Jason felt like they had a real chance. Zora had changed. The walls she had built around herself were slowly crumbling, and Jason saw her not just as a princess but as a person. The tough, no-nonsense leader he had first met was still there, but now there was something softer, openness, a willingness to trust, to allow someone in, and that person, for better or worse, was him. One evening, after a particularly difficult round of talks, Jason and Zora found themselves alone in the garden of the base. The air was cool, and the stars above shone brightly, casting a soft glow over everything. Zora was sitting on a bench, her arms crossed as she stared up at the sky. Jason approached slowly, not wanting to disturb her but not wanting to leave her alone, either. The weight of the day's conversations hung heavily in the air, and he could see the stress in her posture. "You okay?" he asked gently. Zora didn't look at him right away. She took a deep breath, as if trying to shake off the weight of everything. When she finally turned to face him, her eyes were tired but steady. "I'm just thinking," she said softly. "Thinking about everything we've been through, and where we're headed." Jason nodded. He understood. The road ahead was still uncertain, and the pressure on Zora was immense. As much as she had started to trust him, she was still the leader of her people. She still had to carry the burden of their expectations. "Whatever happens," Jason said quietly, "we'll handle it together. I'm not going anywhere." Zora met his gaze then, her expression serious but filled with something else, something more. "I know," she said, her voice softer than usual, "and I appreciate it. More than you know." They stood there for a moment, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the only noise between them. Jason could feel the pull between them again, but this time, it wasn't just about the mission. It was something deeper, something unspoken. "I've learned a lot from you," Zora said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her words caught him off guard, about trust, about letting go of the walls I've built around myself. Jason felt his heart skip a beat, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. This moment was about Zora, about her opening up, and he wanted to listen. "You've helped me see things differently," she continued, her voice steady now. "I never thought I would let someone in, let alone someone like you. But now, I can't imagine doing this without you." Jason's heart swelled with pride. Zora had always been a leader, a symbol of strength, but now she was something more. She was vulnerable, she was human, and she was allowing him to be part of that. "I'm glad to be here with you," Jason said softly, "and I'll keep being here no matter what." Zora nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you, Jason. You've become more than just a soldier to me. You've become a friend, and ... maybe something more." Jason's breath caught in his chest. The words hung in the air between them, but neither of them moved. There was so much unsaid in that simple statement, so many emotions that neither of them had fully acknowledged before. Before Jason could respond, Zora stood up from the bench and walked a few steps away, her hands folded in front of her. "But there's still so much to do," she said, her tone shifting back to the leader he had first met. "The peace talks, the unrest among the factions. We have a lot of work ahead of us, and I won't stop until we get it right." Jason stepped up beside her, watching the determination in her eyes. "I know," he said, "but you don't have to do it alone. I'm right here." Zora turned to look at him, and for the first time, there was no coldness, no distance between them, just understanding. "I know," she whispered, "and that means more than I can say." Jason's heart raced as she stepped closer to him, her hand brushing lightly against his. It wasn't much, just a fleeting touch, but in that moment, it felt like the whole world had paused. They both stood there, silently acknowledging the new beginning between them. Zora pulled her hand away, but the connection remained. She took a deep breath, her focus returning to the task ahead. "We'll finish this together," Jason smiled, his eyes filled with quiet confidence. Together. The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that they were no longer just two people from different worlds. They were partners, facing the future together, with all its challenges and uncertainties. And as they stood there, side by side, looking out at the stars, Jason knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The bond they had formed was unbreakable, and no matter what came next, they would always have each other.